LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
The suggestion is that the function of the brain and nervous system and sense organs is in the main eliminative and not productive. Each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. The function of the brain and nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive or remember at any moment. According to such a theory, each one of us is potentially mind at large. Most people, most of the time, know only what comes through the reducing valve and is consecrated as genuinely real. Certain persons, however, seem to be born with a kind of bypass that circumvents the reducing valve. In others, temporary bypasses may be acquired either spontaneously or as the result of deliberate spiritual exercises, or through hypnosis, or by means of drugs. Through these permanent or temporary bypasses there flows not indeed the perception of everything that is happening everywhere in the universe, but something more than and above all something different from the carefully selected utilitarian material which our narrowed individual minds regard as a complete or at least sufficient picture of reality. In the final stage of egolessness, there is an obscure knowledge that all is in all, that all is actually each. This is as near, I take it, as a finite mind can ever come to perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Anthony Peake, who joins us to discuss his book, Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness. Considering the irreducible complexity of the human brain, and the sense we often have of our bodies feeling more like part of the external world, a vehicle or conduit if you will, while our inner selves, our consciousness, appears to reside elsewhere, we ask, is mind within matter or matter within mind? What and where is consciousness? Is it merely an epiphenomenon of the brain, or is it the origin of all that is? We consider altered states of consciousness, including so-called mental illness, and ask what purpose, if any, they might ultimately serve. Under certain circumstances, such altered states seem to offer glimpses of a much wider reality beyond that normally perceived by our five senses. Building on the ideas of Aldous Huxley and his Doors of Perception, we ponder notions such as past lives, reincarnation, the collective unconscious, and what happens to our world if indeed time, space, and matter are not fundamental. Do we then exist in an unimaginably vast computer simulation? Are we simply avatars in a cosmic computer game? And if so, then who or what is in control? Maybe you have a sense of something else, something long forgotten, only now half remembered. Are these clues left here for us to find in time, or merely glitches in the matrix of our own minds? Hello and welcome, Anthony, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Yeah, wonderful to be chatting to you again, Greg.
Believe it or not, Anthony, 3 years have somehow slipped by since we last did this when we spoke about the infinite minefield back in 2013.
That is incredible. I really am staggered at that.
I know, and then I'd be tempted at this point to say, where does the time go? But then that's got all sorts of interesting implications in itself.
Well, of course, you know, I go through this in my book, The Labyrinth of Time.
Yeah.
So it's something that we could probably discuss as well if you wish.
Yeah, that was our first interview actually in 2012 for The Labyrinth of Time.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, today, Anthony, you've recently released a brand new book that's entitled Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness. As per usual on here, before we dive into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Yeah, sure. The latest book is my 9th. I've been writing now for 10 years. So effectively bringing out almost a book a year, which is incredible. I never ever imagined that this would be the case. My books have now been translated into, I think, around about 10, 11 foreign language editions, and new ones are coming out all the time. Originally, I am from Merseyside, studied sociology, and history at university, but have always been interested in understanding exactly what I am, if that makes any sense, in the sense that I seem to be a conscious something perceiving something, and everything else I can't really prove to any great degree or extent. And this has fascinated me since childhood. So I was in the fortunate position around about 14 years ago, being able to take a year out and fulfill an ambition. I'd worked as a management consultant before that in various companies across the UK and across Europe. And I was in the position that I could take a year out and write a book. And my first book is The Life After Death, has now sold, I think, around about 80,000 copies worldwide, and has been reasonably successful. And I'm now in the nice position of having 4 different publishers, all of whom are very, very keen to publish my work. So I can now pitch for ideas, and I will come up with an idea for a new book, and my publishers will usually say, yeah, okay, we'll take it, which is a nice position to be in, because then they will give me an advance, and they will distribute the book when it's published, and they will market and everything else the book, which makes life easier for me in many ways. But as we were discussing before we started the interview, you know, my overall philosophy is inquiry. I haven't started from a position of belief. I don't write because I'm trying to prove anything. I write through the sheer joy and enthusiasm of learning. And what I'd like to believe is that my many thousands of readers out there are similarly motivated. And we're all on a journey together, and a journey of understanding. So this means my position may change over the years, and this is purely and simply because my knowledge of the subject gets wider by necessity and deeper by necessity. So therefore, my positions may change. But then again, that's how it should be. That's how science works.
Yeah, the byline at LegalizeFreedom.com has always been the big questions. You know, why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And that's why your work resonated with me so strongly when I first discovered it, because it's really addressing these questions from a non-dogmatic point of view. It's just inquiry that leads us where it may, and new information comes along. We can change our positions without fear of being accused of anything, you know, that changing your mind is not actually the root of all evil. That's okay to do that when new information becomes available. And I think that's a problem with a lot of science, in the sense that it becomes, you know, because it starts to behave almost like a religion, in the sense it will start out with a hypothesis. There's nothing wrong with that. And you then want to test it, maybe prove it. But sometimes if a hypothesis that fits in with the status quo turns out that it cannot be proved, in fact suggests something quite different, then it's like, okay, well, we'll put that set of experimental results to one side, and we'll keep doing this until we get the right answer. That, you know, just so no matter what the evidence is telling us, we're going to keep down, you know, the dogmatic line of what has already been established as being. And I think that's a major problem in all these areas of inquiry, isn't it, really? And we're in a strange situation now where we're replete with information that's suggesting cases in scientific inquiry that are the opposites of what's the established accepted paradigm. But we persist, we just set that to one side and persist with like, this is how things are. And just the fundamental nature of reality appears to be not what we've thought it was all the time. And I think that's really where your inquiry is coming in, because you're free to pursue, as I say, to lead wherever the information takes you.
No, absolutely. I think one of the major developmental issues of science over history has always been that science evolves and changes, sometimes quite dramatically, from paradigm to paradigm. Thomas Kuhn, the sociologist, wrote a very famous book on this subject. And in this, he suggested, and I for one agree with him, that science develops by revolutions. And for example, the world of the Aristotelians, the medieval worldview, and the late medieval worldview and early Enlightenment worldview very much worked upon the teachings of Aristotle. Now, the fascinating thing about the teachings of Aristotle was that within their own environment, they made perfectly good sense. The idea that the matter was made of earth, air, fire, and water. They all had their own levels, and they would all move to their own levels because that's where they felt at ease with. How objects moved, that objects moved in perfect circles, that, God had made the universe in a particular way. These things all made rational sense with the understanding of the universe that we had at that time. But what always happens with these worldviews is that within them are seeds of change. And of course, Newton came along and changed everything. Suddenly the Newtonian scientific revolution came along, and we saw the world in a completely different way, which allowed us to start understanding a wider universe. Now, how this occurs is that there are things that don't make sense, that cannot be explained within the present scientific worldview. For example, in the Aristotelian worldview, the problem was the retrograde motion of the planets was one classic example, whereby if the Earth was the center of the solar system and all the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth in perfect circles, you'd be able to calculate exactly how they would move across the sky throughout the year. But certain planets were quite peculiar because they went backwards. Instead of actually going in a perfect circle, they seemed to go back on themselves, retrograde motion. Mercury and Venus did this. And this made no sense within the worldview. So the Aristotelian scientists came up with something they called epicycles. And these were complex mathematical structures to keep alive the paradigm that they saw of the way the universe worked. And of course, it was when Copernicus came along, and subsequently Kepler and Tycho Brahe and various other individuals, who turned around and said, well, if we changed our worldview and recognized that, in fact, the Earth revolved around the sun and that Mercury and Venus were closer to the sun than we were, this would immediately explain retrograde motion. And suddenly the revolution started, and we're saying Newton then came along and explained and suggested, well, discovered gravity is the wrong term, and he most definitely didn't explain gravity in quite the way we think gravity works. But there was a new worldview, and of course, 116 years ago, in December, Max Planck, in December of that year, ushered in the quantum revolution when he delivered a paper in Berlin explaining or attempting to explain something called the black body radiation problem, the ultraviolet catastrophe, the infrared catastrophe. And this then changed the worldview again. And I won't go into detail about this, but these little white crows or black swans sit within science all the time. And at the moment, we have many of them. And these issues cannot be explained. If we want to have a total explanation of how the universe functions in totality, we have to get over one huge problem. And that huge problem is called the hard problem of science. It was suggested in 1994 by a young Australian physicist, a young Australian philosopher, who turned round and said that we cannot explain how inanimate matter and atoms and electricity within the brain can create consciousness. Consciousness is a completely different thing to physical processes. And that young guy was a guy called David Chalmers. Here we are many years later, and the hard problem of science is still with us. We still can't explain consciousness. And seeing as it is the most immediate thing of every sentient being, it's the one thing we do know with absolute certitude, is that we are conscious. And this is something we all know. And this is where my writing comes. My writing is coming in and saying, I'm not restricted by any particular scientific worldview. I'm not restricted by any belief system. I can go where the information points, and I can follow my nose and find out exactly where it's going. And I bravely sometimes come up with hypotheses and ideas. Of course, my critics would say they are pure speculation, and that is their prerogative if they wish to say that. But I believe that I'm starting to pull together something that has an internal rationality and can be supported by empirical experimentation.
Okay, well, in that context then, give us an overview of the latest book and what you're zoning in on with that and how you're endeavouring to move this whole inquiry forward.
Okay, the new book, Opening the Doors of Perception, is deliberately titled, and it is a reference to a 1954 book written by the British, initially the British fictional writer Aldous Huxley. Now, Aldous Huxley had made a reputation in the 1930s and the 1940s as a novelist, but he had moved to America and was living in California and had started to become interested in altered states of consciousness, had started to become interested in what consciousness was. And he read a paper that was written in 1953 by a guy called Humphrey Osmond, who was a British psychiatrist working in a hospital, the Souris Valley Mental Hospital in Saskatchewan, which, interestingly enough, again, one of the wonderful things about researching is you discover these little snippets of information that you have to put in even though it isn't really germane to what you're talking about. And in this particular example, the Souris Valley Mental Hospital was at that time the largest building in the British Empire. So here we have this mental hospital in the prairies of Saskatchewan, which was huge. It was absolutely massive. I'm intrigued as to where the actual patients came from for such a large facility, but there you go. But Osmond and his associate Smithies, both Englishmen, had moved over to work in this location. And they were working with individuals who were alcoholics and individuals who had extreme schizophrenia. Now, Osmond had noticed that sometimes there can be circumstances whereby something that seems to add to a problem seems to make it easier and better. And, for instance, he noted that during the war, under times of great stress, soldiers would fall asleep, which was curious because you would think under stress, under fire, the opposite would take place. You would be hyper-aware. But the opposite happened, that the brain seemed to shut down in some way. And he wondered whether schizophrenia could be treated in that way. In other words, give a schizophrenic a hallucinogenic substance or a psychotropic substance, and it may actually bring down their schizophrenia rather than making it worse. In other words, we could say that schizophrenia is, 100% loss of linking with reality, whereas when you take a psychotropic substance, you're about 50%. And if that psychotropic substance only is effective up to 50%, it may bring back the schizophrenia from 100% to 50% lack of interface with reality. And he found this is what happened. It was as if the substances seemed to ameliorate the problems. He wrote the paper, and this intrigued Aldous Huxley. But what particularly intrigued Huxley was the substance that Osmond and Smithies had been using. And this particular substance was mescaline. Now, mescaline is a derivative of peyote. It's a kind of it's a hallucinogenic substance that the Indians in the far west of America, or the Native Americans, have been using for centuries, and it's distilled from cactus or cacti. And Huxley was very keen to test this substance out. So he requested that there was a big psychological conference taking place in Los Angeles in 1954. And he suggested that maybe Osmond would like to come down, Humphrey Osmond would like to come down from Canada and bring with him 0.4 of a gram of the substance so that Huxley could test it himself. As an aside here, Huxley also had ulterior motives because he was rapidly going blind. He was going blind. He was losing his sight, and he was seeing more and more strange hallucinations. He was seeing things that he couldn't fully appreciate. In the book, I discuss this. These are actually called Cliviform constants, which I will touch on later. But so Osmond came down, and Huxley took the 0.4 of a gram of the mescaline and had the most amazing experience, whereby he, as soon as the substance took hold, he started to perceive reality in a far more profound and detailed way than he had ever done before. He comments that he looked at the chairs around him and noted the beauty and the sheer brilliance of the structures he saw around him. And he was reminded subsequently of the great mystics, like Jakob Boehme, a German mystic in the 16th century, who once made a fantastic statement to say that he saw the universe in a pewter bowl. And Huxley started to think, well, could this be that what is really taking place here is that under normal circumstances, the human brain functions to take out the information that is normally available to it, that is ordinarily available through the senses. So in order for us to function in the world we do, the brain has to act as an attenuator. It has to act as a reducing engine, because we could not function in the world that we exist in if we were taking attention to every single stimuli that was around us. He then remembered the famous poem by William Blake. I think it was from Songs of Innocence, where Blake turns round and says, to see heaven in a wild flower, to hold the universe in your hand. And he said, and he argued, and Blake argued that if the doors of perception were cleansed, we'd see the universe as it really is, infinite. And he thought the doors of perception, what a wonderful title. As an aside, I've always been confused by this, because Blake's statement makes no sense. If the doors of perception were cleansed, well, doors don't need to be cleansed, and you don't ordinarily look through a door, particularly not in the 18th century when he was writing, and I think he actually meant windows, but doors seem to scan better. I don't know, it's always a bit confusing, that one. But what then happened was Huxley wrote a book on his experience called The Doors of Perception. Now, this book, written in 1954, suggested that the brain acts as an attenuator. Now, he was not original in this. He was working, writing about things that people like the great French philosopher Henri Bergson had been writing about years before. The idea that we don't take everything in. And that was my starting point. Because what I wanted to do was to apply the science of the 21st century and revisit the doors of perception as a concept, to see what in that 62, 63 years between now and then, what we have learned about reality, what we've learned about how the brain processes information, what we've learned about psychiatry, what we've learned about neurochemistry, what we've learned about quantum physics and quantum mechanics and ultimately cosmology, can tell us about the brain matter interface and the doors of perception themselves. And this is exactly what I do in the book.
Well, maybe we should imagine patio doors then when we're thinking of doors of perception, glass doors. That's what I did when I first I read that. I had exactly the same thought as you, which is like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Then I just thought of glass doors, and that got me round it conceptually.
Yes, that is a better one. When you said patio doors, I thought, is that Diana Dawes' Irish cousin, I went really seriously for a second there.
Patio doors. Yeah.
Patio doors. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's probably a far better analogy. So we'll use that from now on.
Okay.
I should have called it opening the patio doors of perception, shouldn't I?
Onto the barbecue of reality, yes.
Absolutely. That's even better.
Well,
yeah.
Well, there you go. I'll copyright that right here.
I think you should.
Well, there's all sorts of things to draw out here, but one of the first things that springs to mind, and you were talking about Huxley's experience with the mescaline, and we think about all sorts of psychedelic experience, and ayahuasca is something that's much talked and written about these days. I mean, there's a lot going on out there to do with psychedelics and the nature of reality. And one of the big questions really is then, yes, you have an experience that gives you a temporary access to what appears to be a wider reality, and whether that is some form of what we would loosely call mental illness, whether it's some sort of psychotic break or episode, or whether it is through drug-induced experience, or perhaps even in the realm of dreams, or some other sort of just spontaneous, hallucination, something that just seems to happen, in your everyday waking reality that just makes you stand back and go, whoa, what? And for anyone who's ever had any form of psychedelic experience, and they appear to have, these doors open to this wider world, the question is any of that real?
The question is exactly what we mean by real, and indeed what we mean when we use the term hallucination, because the term hallucination is bandied around as an explanation of certain altered states of consciousness. So if I experience something that I do not share with anybody else, and then this is the regular definition of an hallucination, it is something that my perceptual processing projects into external reality that is not physically there, i.e. it is not physically there because it cannot be consensually proven to be there by an individual standing next to me. So in other words, hallucinations are, in a very real sense, individualized. However, we have the concept of folie à deux, where science readily accepts that two individuals can share an hallucination, in which case they place themselves in a difficult position. Because if we argue that two people can share an hallucination, and if the hallucination is not in external space, the only way we can explain that shared hallucination is telepathy. In other words, mind-to-mind communication, which of course is something else that doesn't fit in with the present scientific paradigm. So to glibly use a slightly more acceptable position and belief to explain another belief and perception is bad science. The telepathy argument doesn't work either. So we have a problem with folie à deux. We also have a problem with collective hallucinations when large groups of individuals seemingly share the same hallucination. Now, this to me suggests that the definition of hallucination is in error. Hallucinations are not what we think they are at all, because if you start to look at the neurology of perception, you start to realize that all perception is an hallucination. And indeed, Charles McCreery and Celia Green, two psychologists, have come together and wrote a very, very fascinating paper, and they came up with something called a metachoric model of reality. And the metachoric model of reality is that everything is an hallucination. So if we change the rules and say that everything we perceive is hallucinatory, suddenly there is no borderline between internal, individualized hallucinations and collective hallucinations, because this is how perception works. And they put forward one or two fascinating arguments about this, which I discuss in the book. For instance, they suggest that if, say, I'm looking at my computer screen now, and I hallucinate, in front of me, a UFO hovering in front of my computer screen, a tiny little UFO hovering in front of my computer screen. There are two hallucinations going on there. There is the hallucination of the flying machine, which is in front of my screen. But there is also an hallucination of exclusion, because the visual field that is obscured by the vision I am seeing is also being taken out of my visual field in order to accommodate the fact that the flying saucer is in front of the screen. And this is something that a lot of people don't actually appreciate. And then we have the issue, if the flying saucer starts to move in my visual field, it has to have a one-to-one relationship with the background that is being obscured by it. In other words, the two hallucinations have to work in concert in order for that hallucination to continue to have credibility. There are other hallucinations that people have in which things people see cast shadows. Now, how can a shadow be cast by something that is not in physical reality? Because effectively it is occluding sunlight, or it's occluding a light source. Or indeed, does the brain so clever that when it creates these hallucinations and places them in the external world, it also calculates in its own way the shadow effect that these things have. Now, there is then the curious hallucinations that take place during states of hypnagogia or hypnopompia. These are hallucinations as you go into sleep or you're waking up in the morning. Individuals who particularly suffer from sleep paralysis, whereby an individual will wake up, will think they're woken up, and they will see supposedly an hallucination of their bedroom. Now, this again is the explanation, supposedly, of these images that people see in the bedroom. You know, you'll wake up in the middle of the night and the room will be illuminated. In the corner of the room, there will be a hunched figure, the hag. Now, this is a known phenomenon. Yeah, they even have a term for it. They call it REM intrusion. But a moment's reflection on this, it means that your brain has recreated internally a complete one-to-one model of your bedroom in your mind's eye, in your dream image. And it is then placed within that image a light source, because under normal circumstances there is, you know, the room is in the dark. You can't normally see things, but in these states you see things. And then within that, they then place another object, which is part of the hallucination, which shows shadows. Because people say you see the face in profile and it's in semi-shadow. Where's the shadow coming from? Indeed, where is the light source? Have we got to believe that our brain is so clever that it can reproduce to the tiniest detail an hallucination? Because this is the only way that modern science can accept something like the out-of-body experience. In the out-of-body experience, you know, somebody wakes up and they feel themselves hovering over their own body, looking down at their body. Okay, it's an hallucination. Yeah, guys, you're right. Great. You've explained it. Only they haven't. They've given themselves far greater problems by hiding behind the labeled explanation of an hallucination, because it means that I am able to recreate in my mind's eye not only a facsimile of my bedroom from an angle that would be unusual to me, because I don't spend time hovering near my ceiling any time. I don't know really what the view is going to be like from the ceiling. But people see a view from the ceiling, and in that view from the ceiling, they see themselves. Now, they come up with the arguments and they say, oh, it's doppelganger syndrome. There's all these wonderful explanations, the labels they come into. They'll say that we can stimulate certain parts of the visual cortex and we can reproduce by brain stimulation the out-of-body experience. No, they can reproduce a sensation of being out of your body. For instance, recent work has been done whereby they have taken virtual reality headsets and they have placed a camera behind somebody, and then they projected the image of the camera into the visual field via the headset of the person, which means in effect the person sees an image of themselves in front of themselves from the back, if I'm making sense on this. What tends to happen then is that there is a psychological effect whereby your consciousness seems to transfer itself to the image in front of you. But people who have had out-of-the-body experiences are quite categoric that the overall sensation of an out-of-the-body experience is not that at all. That you can reproduce something that is similar to doesn't mean you've explained it. We can recreate lots of things that will look like other things. It doesn't mean that you've explained anything. We now know with virtual reality, we know with how digitization works, we can reproduce lots of things in simulation form. It doesn't mean we're actually recreating the actual things. And this is the big issue they miss. They don't think it far enough. So to me, hallucinations are something far more different. And as you know, in my book, The Infinite Mind Field, I discuss in great detail DMT hallucinations. But in the book, the new book, I deal with hallucinations that are perceived by individuals under ordinary circumstances. In general, individuals who have migraine auras, individuals who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, individuals who experience schizophrenia, autism, Savant syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, Charles Bonnet syndrome. These are all experienced by ordinary people, and these experiences are generated by a brain that is functioning using the systems it has available to it. So how is it an ordinary brain can create hallucinations that are similar to DMT?
Well, in the book, you talk a bit about brain chemistry and about the general structure and functioning of the brain. And a lot of what you've just been talking about reminds me that every now and again, when I'm exploring these subjects, the complexity of the brain will somehow, that'll kind of taken as a given, and it slips away from being, front and center of my thinking. And then again, reading your latest book, I was reminded yet again, okay, oh my God, how complex is the brain, not just in terms of chemistry, but in terms of structure. And then I begin to think about, how something like this could possibly develop, what its function is, why it does what it does. And I then arrived back at the realization that, almost everything about the brain is actually on one level unexplained, because as you say yourself, to give something a name, in science, a lot of times that's taken as an explanation, such and such, whatever it happens to be, syndrome, or such and such phenomenon, or such and such process. And then it's almost like, well, we know what this is. It's syndrome X, but no, we don't know what it is. We've just called it something.
Yeah, I call it the labeling theory of science.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, I'm always boggled. My own brain, my own mind is boggled by the complexity of itself. And you're talking here about people's experiences under so-called normal states, i.e. not sort of altered from without by whatever it happens to be, whether it is chemicals or otherwise. And that in itself is very important, I think, because it then introduces the idea that even though we might regard some forms of mental state as quote-unquote illness or not normal, whatever that is, the fact is that these are functions of the brain and body taken together that we can't just write off as like anomalous or without purpose, or this is something to be treated with drugs or something to be stopped. However much someone experiencing schizophrenia or Alzheimer's or migraines might think, this is something bad, this is something to be stopped. For me, it's kind of like, is there a reason for this? There's some kind of function here. The experience of it might be negative by the person undergoing it, but I just don't think that things happen in nature. We just threw that word out there, whatever that means. I just don't think any or all of this happens for no reason. I just don't think it's all anomalous, extraneous, any more than consciousness itself is just kind of like an epiphenomenon of the brain.
Well, that's it, isn't it? The idea that we can explain consciousness by looking at the brain. This is exactly what Chalmers' argument was in 1994. Where he said that the soft problem of consciousness, or the soft problem of the brain, is that we can map fairly accurately what the brain does. We have PET scans and various other devices that can duplicate in 3D the processes that are going on within the brain. But it's the map, not the territory. Effectively, because we know that certain neurotransmitters react in certain ways given certain circumstances, and that certain parts of the brain light up when certain brain activities are visualized. For instance, they have done tests, I don't know how they manage this, but they've done tests whereby somebody plays tennis, and they map the brain of somebody playing tennis, and then they ask somebody to imagine playing tennis, and effectively exactly the same parts of the brain light up when they play tennis to when they imagine playing tennis, which to me begs certain questions about how powerful imagination can be. in many ways, but that's slightly an aside. But all it's doing is mapping things. It's not telling you exactly what is going on. And in none of this neurology and neurochemistry does it even begin to tell us where consciousness comes from. Because consciousness is a very, very different substance for what it's not even a substance, is it? It has no extension in space. It cannot be measured. It cannot be weighed. But it spontaneously appears. Now, in the book, I make the analogy and I say, if that is the case, there must be a point where we start off with atoms. And of course, we know that atoms are 99.9% empty space. There's the nucleus and the electrons whizzing round. Well, they don't whiz round either. There's another misnomer there. But effectively, you put atoms together and you make molecules, and molecules come together and make chemicals, and they make physical things, and they make matter, and all these things come together and get more and more complex, and they react with electricity, and then at some magical point, which must be just the addition of one molecule, or one electron, or one additional chemical, which is also inanimate, suddenly consciousness appears. It just comes, it just appears, as if by magic. Now, we are told, for instance, that certain subatomic particles appear out of the quantum vacuum and disappear back into the quantum vacuum again. I think scientists are playing the same kind of game. It's bootstraps theory. You know, it's the idea that we don't know where it comes from, but it just happens, like the Big Bang. The Big Bang just spontaneously happened, and before the Big Bang there wasn't any time. So at what point did time appear to allow the Big Bang to happen in time? You know, these things are really deep problems that people of a philosophical nature and people who think deeply must realize. You know, it's not a given at all. But consciousness just spontaneously appears. But I can understand how you mix red and green together and you get a different color. I can also understand how the concept of wetness can appear when we mix certain molecules together. You know, hydrogen and oxygen, and suddenly wetness appears, or the sensation of wetness. But that doesn't explain the perception of wetness that the person perceiving the wetness perceives, and indeed the entity inside that person's head that is perceiving the wetness. Because the observer inside the head, the consciousness inside the head, is something completely and utterly different. Now, this is the root of some of the greatest philosophical problems that man has been trying to sort out. Ever since Descartes made the distinction between mind and matter, falling down the trap of dualism, we have had a problem with this. Because modern science says there is no dualism. Everything is just matter. There isn't anything but matter. But consciousness is not matter. And as long as they assume that consciousness is some form of new matter, only by definition it can't be. So we go back to dualism? But science will not accept dualism as a concept. And it's a dirty word. Cartesianism is a dirty word. So we have to go back to monadism. So if it's a monad, if it's a singularity, the only answer is that it is consciousness that is the basis of everything. That it is consciousness that creates matter by the act of observation. Now, because it is unusual for neurochemists and neurologists to be talking to or to understand the finer points of quantum physics, this link is not being made. And the link is a simple one. There is something in quantum physics called the observer problem, the measurement problem. And in simple terms, this is that a subatomic particle, an electron, an atom, even a molecule, there's been work done in recent years, very big molecules have the same effect. Buckminster fullerene has 60 atoms in it. It has the same effect. And in effect, what this is that until the object is observed or measured, it is a quantum, it is a wave of probabilities. This is a really weird idea. The idea that there is a probability wave, which doesn't exist in any way we understand to exist means. And when it's measured or observed, it suddenly becomes a point particle. So the Buckminster fullerene, with its 60 atoms, doesn't exist anywhere in real space and in time. And when we measure it or observe it, it suddenly appears as if from nowhere as this huge molecule of 60 atoms. This is not science fiction. You know, if anybody out there is nodding their heads and saying this is nonsense, just do look at the science, look at the papers. I can even tell you who's doing this research. It's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. So go out there and look it up if you don't believe what I'm talking about. I'm talking not to you, Greg, because I know that, but listeners out there who are going, oh, this is all woo-woo crap. So, the act of observation, or the act of measurement, and there's big arguments as to where observation stops and measurement starts, because can you have an act of measurement? If I put a ruler down on a table, can we arguably say that an act of measurement is taking place because the ruler has inch signs on it? Of course you can't. The act of measurement takes place when somebody looks at the ruler and says, that ruler's a foot long, which actually means the desk is 2 foot long. That's the act of measurement. It's the act of measurement when an observer observes the act of measurement. So in which case we're now back to the mind, because of course the observer is a mind doing the observation. Now if every single subatomic particle and every atom within the universe has this wave particle duality, has this wave factor that needs to be measured or observed, it means that everything, because everything that is made of matter is made of molecules, and they exist within fields. And fields are a mystery in their own way, by the way. You know, they don't really fully understand. They understand how fields function. They don't understand what fields actually are. Just like they don't understand what gravity is. You know, they can calculate how gravity has effects, but they don't really know what it is. So here we have the idea that the universe is created by the act of consciousness. So suddenly we have back to dualism, back to monadism, back to the idea of one single something which creates everything. Now this is going back now to the ideas of Vedanta within Hinduism. It's going back to Buddhism. It's going back to the idea that the core essence of everything is consciousness. And indeed, that this consciousness is a singularity. That there is a single consciousness is what everything is. And individual consciousnesses such as Greg Moffitt's and Anthony Peake are just emanations of that consciousness field. And the Greg Moffitts and the Anthony Peakes of this world then, by their act of observation, bring in the physical universe around us. When we look at it this way, suddenly the idea of how brain creates consciousness goes out the window. The brain doesn't create consciousness. The brain is a physical receiver of consciousness in some way. You know, it's as if it's something that reduces the consciousness wave into a point of consciousness in exactly the same way, in which case hallucinations now become something quite different. Hallucinations are emanations of the act of observation. And if they are part of the act of observation, they are just as real as external three-dimensional reality, just as real as external reality that is shared by other people. So suddenly, all these strange effects that people have suddenly become far more mysterious and far more strange and far more difficult to understand within our present scientific worldview. And this brings us beautifully round back again to the mystery of, or the idea of a paradigm change. And I think it's these details and these issues are going to be the little things that are going to bring down the present paradigm and actually push us into a new paradigm. Because in this way, we might be able to explain dark matter. We also, it is an idea that the consciousness field may be something to do with 0-point energy, which is something that we know permeates everywhere. It's almost the modern day equivalent of the luminiferous ether. We also know now that there's a bigger argument coming forward, which is developing and developing, which is the simulation argument, that this universe is a non-physical universe because it's a simulation. It's created out of digital information. And yet again, we're coming back to, where does the digital information get processed? How does it get perceived? What is the thing that's processing that digital information? Consciousness. So suddenly we're having a much, much deeper understanding, because this could explain non-locality. It could explain an awful lot of the mysteries of quantum physics. All we need is a different way of thinking. And if we think differently, the answers will come.
For me, this brings us also back to the very idea of Huxley's reducing valve, that there is this vast something beyond our everyday perception that is significant. You know, it isn't just something that we dream about, or it's not something that can be discarded in the morning. It's not something that's unimportant. It's somehow significant. And I've always had the strongest sense, and you mentioned in the early part of your book that in many ways, for many of us, our body feels like part of what we perceive to be an external physical 3D world, whereas our sense of self feels quite distinct from that. And a lot of people will say, no, I don't have that. You know, that's the whole sort of consciousness is produced by the brain. You have people who think like that, who maybe feel like that. But I think if we allow ourselves to go within ourselves, that's where we end up, which is like the body is kind of something. I mean, you even sit down, put your hands in front of your face and look at your hands. And does that feel like, for me, it feels like a suit. It's like something that I've occupied in order to have this experience. And when we consider that, I'm then brought back to a question of why we're even having this conversation. That is to say, why are we not content just to go about our everyday lives in this 3D reality and accept it completely as it is? Why are we having conversations where we're kind of hinting to each other, you know, is this real or is this a dream? If you see what I mean, it's like, yes. Why do we even think there is anything else? And then the last point from that is, okay, is that some kind of malfunction? Is that some kind of quirk in evolutionary development? Or is there a reason why we're supposed to be coming to, is something supposed to be dawning on us, if you see what I mean? Are we supposed to be having this inquiry? Or is it just some form of mental illness because we're struggling to deal with something? And the latter idea that all this inquiry, this metaphysical, existential stuff is all just because we can't accept things the way they really are. Well, I've always asked, well, what is the evolutionary purpose of that? Why would we put ourselves in a position of such angst, such dread, such fear, when all we should really be doing is just sitting around in the savannah kind of like here and occasionally going up trees and munching fruit? Wouldn't that function all a lot better? Why do we have this inquiry? Why are we beset in the way that we are? Why are we haunted by this sense of something else?
I would argue that most people aren't. You know, that's the thing. Most people do not think the way we do, and I presume the way a lot of your listeners think. It's as if they are in this kind of dream sequence. I know that to use the analogy of the Matrix movie is a wrong one, but in many ways it works as a Gnostic viewpoint, if nothing else. And the idea that most people are happy with the taste of what the things they taste. They never worry about whether it's real or not. And most people I talk to, the vast majority of people in my world, whenever I start talking about these things, they don't think deeply enough about what it is to be here, what it is to be a sentient anything. As you rightly say, for evolutionary purposes, why did we need to evolve to have sentience at all? You know, you look at single-celled creatures, some of them are the most successful things on the planet. You know, so to say that it's an evolutionary imperative doesn't really make any great deal of sense. Now, I'm not a teleologist. I'm not somebody that believes that there is a final outcome here. But just for a second, posit the argument that if this is a simulation, and that within the simulation, we, as points of consciousness, individuated points of consciousness from the collective unconscious, the Jungian collective unconscious, that we don't live this life once within the simulation, but we live it many, many times. Your individual life is like a first-person computer game. And in the first-person computer game, as you know, there is the scenario that the on-screen sprite, Lara Croft, or whatever you want to call your on-screen sprite, or whatever game you're playing, you switch on the game, and the game player starts the game, and the on-screen sprite is born. Imagine that the on-screen sprite has a degree of consciousness. She just comes into existence. She doesn't know why she's there, and she doesn't know the reason for her being there. She is what the existentialists called thrown in. It's something that I think it was either Kierkegaard or Heidegger, it might have been Heidegger, said that we are thrown into the universe. Because we are. You know, we are born into this world. We didn't choose to come here. We just are here. We're thrown in. There's a German word, which I can't remember, which is the word thrown in. So here we have Lara Croft thrown in to the scenario, the world, the digital world she exists within. She feels herself starting to run down a corridor. She feels she's motivating herself to walk down the corridor, but the reality is the game player is moving her. And this again is an interesting point, because we know neurologically that sometimes free will isn't quite what we believe it to be. You know, there's been lots of research done on this, that the body has already made its decision to move in a certain way before consciousness has made the decision to make that movement, which suggests that we're motivated sometimes by other things, literally the word motivation, to move, you know. So Lara goes down the corridor and she goes into a room, big monster comes out and she kills her. She's dead. Her sentience has gone. The game player, on the other hand, hasn't gone. The game player has witnessed the demise of the on-screen sprite, something I call the Eidolon, which I'll come back to in a second. And she goes back to the start of the game again. And she's reborn again. Bing! She's back, thrown in again, with no memory of having lived lived a previous life. It had a previous existence. This again is something the ancient Greeks talked about. They had this whole concept of the way the memories can be wiped by drinking the waters of the River Leith and going back and living your life again. So this is something that's deep in philosophy, it's deep in belief systems, subliminally. So Lara again goes down the corridor, but this time she finds herself running in a different direction and away from the room. She doesn't know why, there's just an instinct that tells her not to go into that room. This is because the game player, the daemon, as I call it, your higher self, now knows that that room is dangerous. And it makes Lara run down another corridor. Now, the game is designed in such a way that wherever Lara goes, the on-screen environment is rendered to accommodate her movements. And it's rendered as she encounters things, they are rendered. But there is a full three-dimensional world out there that Lara can go anywhere, but it's all in potentiality. Now, the people on the ball out there will be thinking, hold on a minute, isn't that just what Anthony said about how we collapse the wave function to bring about our own reality? Do we not create the reality around us by the act of observation? Yes, but it's a computer game. So as you move round the computer game, the pixelation changes and it accommodates what you can see with your senses and you perceive with your senses, or what Lara sees. She runs down the next corridor, goes into another room, and she's killed again. Bang, she's dead again. But the game player now has two pieces of information that he can help her get through her life, through the game. And over a period of 10, 20, 40, 60, 100, 10,000, a million games, the game player, the daemon, Daemon understands and gets Lara through the game. Now, this game is for Lara ultimately, and the daemon, because it's the daemon that is doing the learning, remember. Lara only learns each game. She doesn't remember to the next game. But the daemon does. The daemon, the world inside the computer game is just as much a mystery to the daemon, to the game player, as it is to the on-screen sprite. It's just that the game player uses the on-screen sprite to investigate what that world is made of. And this is the basic principle of all first-person computer games. You know, environmental computer games. This is what it's all about, discovering the world around you. So what happens is, over many, many games, over many, many iterations, the daemon completes the game. And the game is ultimately realizing that the game is greater than we feel. In other words, it's becoming enlightened. It's becoming aware. Now, I think in some way this is what is happening now. Or maybe it happens to different people at different times. Now, if we are all in a game and all our games are interfacing with each other, in other words, we're like a version of Second Life almost, whereby we are all inside the game and we all have daemons playing the game from outside. Some of us have played the game for a long, long time, and our daemons are getting towards the end of the game. And the knowledge at the end of the game is that this is a simulation. And the awareness of the fact that it's a simulation is the point in which you are ready to move on to whatever the next iteration is. So this is why certain people are not even thinking these ways, because they're not far enough along their own games within our version of the environment. They might be in other versions of the environment. Now, this is becoming self-aware. Now, if we look at all mystical traditions, and this is what I try to do, I'm very eclectic, I'm very Catholic in my approach to ideas, that take information from Gnosticism, take information from the great philosophical belief systems, such as Vedanta, such as Buddhism. There are the various other ones, even the Huna tradition of the Polynesian people. You start to realize there are certain themes. You look in Sufism, you look in the Kabbalah. All these things are preaching the same thing. They're all telling us that we are here for a purpose, to live our lives many times, to discover the God within. To discover two things. A, this is a simulation. And B, that I am part of a greater consciousness, a greater singular consciousness. This is pandeism, and I've contributed a chapter to a new book on pandeism, which comes out in January. So the idea is you can then use science to show exactly what is going on. Now, going back to my book, I argue that certain conditions allow a person who may not have developed along the lines as much to see through the doors of perception and see that it is in fact a simulation. But because they are ill, in raised commas, they are not ready for it yet. So for a schizophrenic to realize the true nature of the simulation will literally drive them crazy. Temporal lobe epileptics will be totally confused by the things they see, the worlds they see, and the environments they find themselves within. To a lesser extent, classical migraineurs will find the same thing when they see their visual field break down, as I do. You know, when my visual field will literally break down into pixelation in front of my eyes. I see the pixelation of the reality around me. Now, if this is the case, this is why some people say that you cannot reach enlightenment without training, without following certain routes of learning, you know, becoming an adept, becoming a monk, becoming whatever. But for 99.9% of the population, what they want out of life is the physical things. They want the bigger house, they want the flash car, they want the huge flat screen television. And as long as you are tied to the physical things within this world, you will never escape from it. Because you're tied into it, you're too engaged with it. But if everybody disengaged, society wouldn't function. So as a sociologist, I can say we couldn't function correctly. But there must be a point where mankind collectively will change. And this is the thing they called ascension, you know, and I think that's probably a load of nonsense. But effectively, you can see how the garbled message is coming through here. And I think this, to me, makes phenomenal sense. It may not make sense to everybody else, and maybe it's not supposed to. Because this is my search within my Phaneron, within my game. And my daemon is guiding me through this. So, for me, this book is just part of my learning within the matrix, within the hallucination, within the game. Some of us are further down the game than others. It's like a Groundhog Life. Like the movie, The Groundhog Day, he lives the same day over and over again, till in the end he starts doing good things for doing good things' sake. And then he moves on. What we move on to, I do not know, and I have no idea. But it excites me.
I want to understand more about the nature of the game to the point where everything I do, from making breakfast to to going to work, to interacting with people in my life, I see it through that lens. Now, of course, sometimes you're in the moment, and of course you're doing these things in the physical 3D reality, and you're not thinking about the nature of the game, but I come back to it increasingly in shorter and shorter periods of time. I can be having a conversation with someone that's quite mundane, in a shop buying something across the counter, and while the person's working away, bagging the goods or working at the till, my mind wanders off, and suddenly I see it in the game context, and it's not. I guess if I was disturbed by it, then I'd qualify as mentally ill, and I'd go to the doctor and say, "Doctor, help me! What's happening? It's all breaking down." But I actually enjoy it immensely, and I wonder if the sense that I suspect that you get, and that everyone gets to a greater or lesser extent, it depends how much attention you pay to it and how you act on it. But this sense of do this, don't do that seems to come from somewhere else. We call it intuition, whatever it happens to be. Don't go through that door, or turn left. You're going to turn right, don't turn left, or don't go there on this day, wait, or don't get on that plane, and all these things are almost like the joystick and the buttons being pressed somewhere by the controller.
Yeah.
That's sometimes how it feels anyway.
Oh, no, totally. I mean, in my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, this is what I write about there. And this is the thing that I find quite uncanny, is that all my books, all of which were written in isolation in many ways, and at least initially, all seem to be a developmental process to get me to this point. All the books contain elements of this book and the supporting material. To really fully understand what makes me tick, you really have to read all 9 books, because you can see how things develop in me and how I come across new ideas and how I bring them together and pull them together to my own satisfaction, not necessarily to other people, but then again, all well and good. But I am reminded here, my next book, which I literally finished the first part of the manuscript yesterday, so it's written now but needs to be honed, is going to be a book on J.B. Priestley, the British novelist and playwright, and the ideas that stimulated his time plays and various other things, because I believe there is a time now that's needed where we need to review the work of J.B. Priestley in the light of modern science. The guy was incredible. He was so far ahead, people thought he was old-fashioned. He was out of sight. He was so far ahead. A bit like Philip K. Dick in many ways, but even more so. But the thing is that I'm rereading a lot of the material that I read many, many years ago. And I've been rereading a lot of Peter Ouspensky, the Russian philosopher. And Ouspensky was a profound influence upon J.B. Priestley. And I reread my good friend Gary Lachman's book on Ouspensky. And I was fascinated by Ouspensky's logic, because Ouspensky took a very similar process, very similar ideas to myself. It's quite uncanny how close Ouspensky and I are. But Ouspensky argued that in order to move on and move out of this rebirth and living your life again, or living a life again as you, but differently, is to not engage closely with the reality you're within. Now, of course, I made the point about not being too attached to physical things that are passing that you don't need, but also the need to engage in your ideas as well. Because the very fact that I have written books and my books are out there and people are coming to me and discussing my books with me, that is a form of attachment that I have created within the simulation by writing the books. My limited fame has given me an attachment again to the simulation, which Ouspensky argued is something that pulls you back into it and stops you moving on. And ultimately, you need to move on by not becoming famous in raised commas. Ouspensky tried very hard to limit his fame, because he felt the more famous he became, the more he would become involved still within the simulation, although he never called it that. And I think that's a fascinating idea, that maybe I'm not there yet. And next time round, my daemon will carry all the information that I have gleaned from writing my books. And the next iteration, when I come through, I will not write the books because I don't need to. In other words, I keep saying in other words too, I must stop doing that, by the way. I know it's irritating because I've noticed listening to my recent interviews, it's a new verbal tick I've acquired, which I must stop. That in order to really move on, we have to cut all links with the world that we're within. So next time round, it is highly likely that my daemon will say, you don't need to write the books anymore. Just live a very, very normal life. Just become obscure again. I mean, because one of the things is, within certain circles, I'm becoming more and more famous, which I find amazing. People now recognize me. On 2 or 3 occasions recently, if somebody will stop me in the street and say, oh, you're Anthony Peake. For instance, I was in Watkins Bookshop 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was coming up the stairs, and this Swedish guy stopped me and he said, oh, I'm one of your biggest fans. I've listened to all your interviews. I've got all your books. And you're going, whoa. And it's not why I write. I don't write for fame. And the people who know me know that I don't. It's not what I'm into. I'm into getting the ideas across. But that causes attachment. And really, maybe you don't need that. And maybe this is why people become monks, or they move away from mainstream society and go to live on mountaintops, or like Simon Stylites, you actually end up on the top of a pole and sit on the top of the pole for most of your life. The drawing away from the normal world seems to be something that mystics have done for centuries. And could it be that the mystics are the people who have already lived their lives to the extreme? They have done everything they've needed to do, and the final life is a life of quiet contemplation, because their daemon is almost there, and they need to just inwardly take everything in quietly and just live the perfect life. So you then move on, and your Groundhog Day changes, and you're allowed to move on to the next day.
That's really interesting. Just before I forget, I want to throw in there that what you were saying brought up a really strong sense in me that I've had from time to time, and it just came back like a wave. At times in my life when I've thought, sod this, I should just live on a mountaintop, or I should just check into a monastery or whatever, but I've had the strongest sense, profound sense, no, not this time. You are here to engage in the game. You're here to be amongst people, to be active. That's what you're doing this time. It's very, very strong. So there's no way that I could go and live on a mountaintop. That's not what I'm supposed to do. I don't know why I know that, but I know it for sure.
One of the strangest events took place a few years ago when I wrote my first book, that I've only rarely touched upon in interviews, but if we have time, I'd just like to go through it with you. Is that okay?
How do we have time, Anthony? No.
Yeah, of course. But I'd just like to explain this if it's okay with you.
Of course.
Okay, it was, I received an email one afternoon from a family in Australia, in a place called Serpentine, near Perth, in Western Australia. And the email said, the strangest thing has just taken place. We were having our meal, and there was a knock on the door. And we went to the door, and standing there was a Buddhist monk in full Buddhist regalia. Well, not regalia, just the saffron robes. And the Buddhist monk was holding a piece of paper, and he said, here is the email address of a guy that lives in England. Can you please email him and say that I need his home address so I can write to him? I don't have a computer in the monastery because we don't. And the locals said to me, we didn't realise there was a monastery locally, particularly not a Buddhist monastery. And he handed the piece of paper, and then he just turned round and wandered down the street, and they watched him walk down the road till he became a little dot in the distance. And they said, did that just happen? So they emailed me, and I sent my address back because I was intrigued. And a few weeks later, I get a letter back from somebody called Ekegatu Bhikkhu, who is at the Bonahinya Monastery in Serpentine, Western Australia. And the letter was amazing because he was saying that he had, by the most curious set of circumstances, come across an academic paper I wrote way back in 1999. No, it wasn't. It was 2004, in fact. Just checked it because I've got it on my wall. It was 2004. The paper was written, and it was a paper I introduced the world to my cheating the ferryman concept, and it was published in the International Journal of International Association of Near-Death Studies journal. And how in the letter he explained, he said that there's only a handful of monks in our monastery, and we all live out in the bush, in tiny huts. And he said, I'm part of what's called the forest tradition of Buddhism, which is the most austere form of Buddhism. It's a Thai tradition, but it has its roots in the Bon tradition of Tibet. Very, very austere. And he said that my hut was being done out, and I needed to move to another one that hadn't been inhabited for a few months. And he said, I went into the hut, and in the middle of the hut was a chair, and it had a wonky leg. And underneath the leg, somebody had folded series of pieces of paper to make the leg stand straight. Something inside of him said this piece of paper is very important. So he picked it up and he unfolded it. And it was a photocopy of my paper that had been written for an American journal, sitting on the floor of a monastery in the outback in Western Australia. He picks it up and he reads it, and it stuns him. And he said, my God, this guy has got Buddhism. He is doing the science of Buddhism. He's so excited he wants to contact me. Now, he and I then swapped letters, and then he announced that he was coming over to England about 3 years later. And we met at the Forest Monastery near Banbury. And it was coincidental because we tried a few times, and he was travelling around the country doing various monasteries. And we managed to arrange this particular day at random. And I turned up at the monastery, and there's bunting around and there's celebrations. And I suddenly realised that the day I had picked at random was the most important day in the Buddhist calendar. It was the day that the Buddha was born, it was the day the Buddha reached enlightenment, and it was the day he died. And I thought, wow, that's a coincidence. And then this guy turns up, and Ekegatu Bhikkhu is an American guy. And he used to be a roadie with the Grateful Dead. And he used to be involved in the music scene in LA. And he'd given everything up to become a Buddhist monk. He'd got to the point in his life where he thought he'd done everything. The only thing he wanted to do was give everything up, which he did. He moved to Tibet and did the whole thing. Now, that whole incident fascinated me because I thought, this is bizarre beyond words. How did that article end up there? 3 years ago, you may know that I wrote a book with 2 Australian consultant psychiatrists called Making Sense of Near-Death Experience, which had lots of contributors from around the world experts in near-death experience. In fact, that book was nominated for the Psychiatric Book of the Year by the British Medical Association 3 years ago. We didn't win it, but we were highly commended. So, that is some kind of scientific recognition of my work. When one of the authors, Dr. Mahendra Pereira, came to the UK, he's a Sinhalese guy, but he lives in Australia. And I'd met him in Sri Lanka once, and then we met in London. And I told him that story. Yeah, I met up with him and another near-death researcher called Ornella Karatsa, Dr. Ornella Karatsa. And I told that story, and they were both amazed, but Mahendra was particularly stunned. And he said, I think I can explain how that paper ended up on the floor of the monastery. And it seems that Mahendra, before he knew me, had read my paper and was so impressed with it, he photocopied it and he sent it to a friend of his who was the main man in the monastery, who apparently is a Cambridge-educated quantum physicist. And he wanted this guy to read it. Clearly, the Cambridge-educated quantum physicist was not profoundly impressed with the paper, because that's why it ended up in a hut holding a chair up, which I need to dig a little bit more to find out how that happened. But there was this kind of wonderful series of coincidences, synchronicities, call it what you will, that made me realize that this is a simulation. There are things that happen that are just strange, beyond strangeness. Now, one could accommodate that story, but to me, it was a learning experience for me at that time. And it is only now, after having that monologue towards the end of our interview just before, because I'd never actually discussed the idea of the final life where you go into monasticism. So, Greg, that's the first time I've ever mentioned that in an interview, and in fact the first time I've ever really considered it. But it makes sense to me. And maybe that again was a message to me, because I've been fascinated by Buddhism and various aspects of this. Maybe this is the next move. Maybe for me, the next time round, that's what I'm going to do.
Well, you mentioned earlier about the Matrix, and some people feel that can be overused in terms of analogies and comparisons, but I find it an incredibly useful piece of pop culture, and it might be done to death, but I come back to it constantly because it's a very prescient film, and it brings together a number of very key ideas, I think. So, but the reason I mention it here is because just the idea of injecting something into the Matrix to get the attention of one of the game players. If you see what I mean, it's just like, okay, the time we have to do this so we get their attention. In fact, what I was thinking during some of what you were talking about just there was this whole idea of living multiple lives, coming back into the game again, sort of like, just like in a computer game, you've got a number of lives, don't you? And it's like, oh, I'm down to one life. You'll say, I've got to battle the aliens here, because if this, if I lose this life, then it's all over or whatever. Well, if it's all over, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I love this idea of different levels of awareness that we talked about in terms of most people going about their daily lives, either content or discontented or something in between, focused on physical things. But there's an element of choice in this, it seems, depending on how you consider certain game scenarios, what this might be. Is there an element of choice? We clean the slate to come into the game in that state of awareness? Or do we sometimes choose to carry over what we have learned from previous goes at the game? And then you get into the idea of past lives, don't you? And I underwent a past life regression and had the most powerful sense of a reality of what came back to me. That it was every bit as profound as of how I feel a sense of identity about me sitting here now talking to you. It didn't feel like a dream at all. It was like, of course I did that. That was a game. That was another go round, and I learned something from it. And I felt a sense of myself in the body that I was sort of during that past life regression. I felt injected back into that kind of avatar. It was kind of like, do you remember this one? Oh yeah, wasn't this like about 1,000 years ago? And yeah, and we did this, and there was these people and these places, and I had forgotten about this, and it felt so familiar, like I could just have stayed there. But at the back of my consciousness, of my awareness, was the idea, yeah, but remember, you're temporarily injected into this, you're just having a look again, you've just put those particular glasses on, you're just looking at, you'll take those off in a minute, and you'll be back here doing this one. And it makes me wonder, someday, am I going to be injected back into this? It's like, oh yes, remember that? Oh my God, yes, the Anthony Peake character, yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting one, in the sense that initially, when my original books, one of the major problems I had with individuals who'd had past life regressions was that within my model, past life regressions couldn't be accommodated. Mm-hmm. As it's developed, I think past life regressions can be accommodated, because if we are all one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, we are everybody and everybody is us. So therefore, every experience that humanity has had is part of our experience, and we can go into those experiences. And if there is a time outside of this time. You know, if there is a fourth dimension or a fifth dimension, a dimension of eternity, where everything happens at the same time, everything is concurrent. And of course, this is, you will not necessarily be aware of this, but this was one of the major themes of the writings of J.B. Priestley. He was influenced by, as I say, Peter Ouspensky. He was also influenced by Carl Gustav Jung, and he was also influenced by a comparatively obscure Anglo-Irish aviator called John William Dunn. And all three of these individuals influenced Priestley to write plays trying to get their ideas across. And in many of Priestley's plays, there are time slips, there are people who go back in time, there are people who perceive memories from a deep past. And of course, this is profoundly Jungian, because Jung came up with the concept of the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is greater than all of us and is also part of us. But there is also the counter-argument to say that DNA carries memory. And if DNA carries memories, there is absolutely no reason to conclude that you could not tune in to the experiences of one of your ancestors. For instance, one of the great mysteries of modern science, and again, it is one of the white crows or the black swans, is the issue of how it is you can take very young birds, you know, birds 1 day old, chicks, and you place them in a room, and you fly. If you take a cardboard cutout of a hawk and you fly it over them, or you put it over them, they cower. Now, that means that there is something instinctive in that cowering. But in order for the instinct to kick in, there has to be a recognition. So the recognition is that hawks are dangerous, which means that there's some form of memory being carried through in the genetic code to make them recognize that. Now, you can extrapolate from that and say, well, if memories as small as that can be reproduced, why can't full memories be reproduced? And of course, the mystery of memory is something, again, I've touched upon in many of my books over the years, and the idea of the location of memory. And in the new book, I very much suggest and propose that memory is distributed across the brain, and consciousness is distributed across the brain in different ways to the way we normally understand it. You know, I think it's the astroglial network rather than the neuronal network. And there's work being done recently that suggests that's to be true. I mean, for instance, there's a guy called Andrew Koob who wrote a book in 2009 called The Roots of Thought. And in this, he argues that glial cells and something called calcium waves are the way in which thoughts cross the brain. But these, again, are waves that are kind of created within the brain. So we're back to waves again, and wave and particle duality and everything else. So it's starting to get very, very strange and very, very weird. But ultimately, what does this tell us? What does this tell us about us as beings? Well, it tells us that we know such a tiny amount, or science knows such a tiny, tiny amount of what reality is all about. But we suffer from hubris. We believe that we know it all, that our answers are the correct answers. But the medieval schoolmen had the same belief. They thought they knew everything. As did, let's see as an example, in 1894, Albert Michelson, the guy that did the Michelson-Morley experiment, was opening an event at the University of Chicago. He was opening a new building there. And he turned around and he was paraphrasing, I think, Lord Kelvin. But he was making a statement, and he said that science is now at the point where we are almost at the end of science. Future scientists will only be calculating to the 6th decimal point finer and finer understandings of the external world. But he did say, he said, but there are 1 or 2 black clouds on the horizon that we're really not sure about. And one of them was blackbody radiation, which was what the paper in 1900 Max Planck wrote about, which brought about the quantum revolution. So we always have to be aware of the fact that there are things that our science cannot accommodate and cannot understand by using the present scientific models which will be the things that will create the new scientific paradigm. And I think we are teetering on the edge of that at the moment.
I totally agree. And as I say, I don't find it intimidating at all. I find it extremely exciting. And as for all the paradigms that we've been labouring under for not that long, actually, because as you pointed out before, some of the things that we accept scientifically about the nature of reality, life, the universe and everything, are, maybe 100 years old, a couple of 100 years old, and even quantum physics hasn't been integrated by any means, not even just into science, but into life in general. So
quantum physics can't even be integrated into Einstein's theories of relativity. You plug the maths in that they're using quantum physics into Einstein, and you get answers like infinity. So, they can't even plug into each other yet. And that's one of the things that most scientists are in denial about. They won't talk about this, but it's a fact.
Well, Anthony, as we kind of begin to bring things to a close for today, we've talked a lot about the simulation theory and the idea, the game idea. For me, I find that actually treating life on one level, just to continue the game analogy, on one level like a game, actually to be quite effective in many ways. Because I remember, as a kid, being told, the adults would use phrases like, this isn't a game, not necessarily about life in general, but just about something you might be doing. The idea being that a game is always something trivial, something for leisure time, and that's generally how we think of these things. If you approach life like that, I find it to be most entertaining, even when things don't appear to be going well. Even when something negative happens, if you look at it through that lens, if you consider it as part of the kind of potential reality we're talking about, that changes a lot of things. And just to wheel the matrix out again, there's a rule set here. It's not as limited as we think. It can be bent. It can be malleable, just in the way, in the Matrix that Neo was coaxed through letting go of his ideas about what the game is, what the parameters are, and it's much, much wider than we imagine. There's a lot of potential here, and I think that in a strange way that our basic ideas about, what a game is, whether it's a computer game or otherwise, and that rules are written by, like, for example, say the rules of chess are laid down, the game becomes meaningless if you tear that up. But does it? It just becomes something else. And I think that a lot of the science, a lot of the cutting edge ideas, the boundaries that your work is pushing ties in with what I've just been saying. There is a rule set here, but it may be evolving, or at the very least, it's wider and deeper than we currently believe.
Absolutely agree.
So, final point. In terms of reality, if we think of ourselves as perhaps being avatars within a game, we have to ask ourselves then, in reality, which reality is really the real reality, if you see what I mean. Do we get into an infinite regress of games? Is the game controller in a game itself?
That's the interesting point. The interesting idea is that if the reality we perceive is a simulation, who are the creators of the simulation? And again, it was Nick Bostrom in 2003 who was the mathematical physicist that first broke the idea in a structured and mathematical way and in a logical way that this could be a simulation. And this is the major question, that if it is a simulation, who are the creators of the simulation? And I think there is powerful evidence, and Bostrom suggests this as well, that it's our own descendants, and that we are existing in some form of ancestor simulation, running on computer systems that we can only even vaguely imagine. Because if we apply Moore's law, Moore was one of the founders of Intel, and in the mid-1960s, he came up with his Moore's law, which was effectively that the power of computing doubles every 2 years. It's moved out to 3 years recently, but still the rule applies. That you extrapolate that out, the only thing that restricts us is miniaturization. And with developments now in quantum computing, which I discuss in some of my earlier works, where we could use the Everett's many worlds interpretation and iterations on the Everett's many worlds interpretation to have computers working in alternate realities or alternate universes. The computing power could be almost limitless. And in which case you could create simulations, and you would populate those simulations with sims. And what would you do? You would probably create a historical background to your society, and you would populate it with individuals who had once lived. And if you did that, of course, you'd have to get over something called the substrate problem, which is, if I scanned Greg Moffat's brain and every single process within your brain and digitized that and uploaded that into a computer and then killed you, are you still existing? And it's a big philosophical issue and a massive philosophical problem, and one we're not even near, because this comes back again to the idea of where consciousness comes from. The very idea that I've just suggested is very much the idea of post-humanism, and the idea that we could upload ourselves into computers. And a guy called Ray Kurzweil has done a great deal of work on this, and the idea of post-humanism, and that we and machines will become hybridized, and the future of humanity will be in these hybridized creatures that are both human and non-human. But the issue still occurs that you can't get over the problem of consciousness being created, and whether self-referential ever can. But the fascinating thing here is that there is more and more information coming through that shows that we are a simulation. I mean, there's a guy called Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute, another physicist who's been working on this for quite a few years. And he's been working on the idea that you can analyze the universe as it works, and you can look at the digitization, you can discover the digitization. I do not have time to go into details here, but the last chapter of the book, I take the reader through some quite esoteric material, suggesting works from people like Stephen Hawking radiation, the event horizon around black holes, and the way in which the loss of information into black holes suggests that information may be smeared around the edges of the known universe, and this information is holographic in nature, and these are three-dimensional holograms. They're actually sending inside the sphere of the universe two-dimensional holograms, which is the world we exist within. And again, this sounds peculiar and strange. I am taking this directly, or I did take the material directly from a New Scientist article written by a guy called Jacob Bekenstein in, I think, 2003, 2004. So this is not wacko stuff. I mean, John Archibald Wheeler, who was one of the most famous quantum physicists of his generation, wrote in 1989 and came up with a concept called it from bit. And what he meant from it from bit is exactly what I'm saying. It, physical reality, matter, from bit, digital information. So here we have something very powerful. And again, if somebody wants to read the work of the leading edge person on this at the moment, there's a guy called, whose name has escaped me now. He's professor of physics at the University of Singapore, Vlatko Vedrell. And Vlatko Vedrell wrote an amazing book 2 or 3 years ago, putting forward all the evidence that everything we perceive is digital information. It's just bits. It's 0 and 0, or an equivalent of.
Yes, well, Vlatko has been a guest on here, and people can find that interview
Great.
At legalizefreedom.com. Of course, and for more on these ideas, they can also find on this interview page, people will find links to our interviews for both The Labyrinth of Time and The Infinite Minefield. Today, Anthony, we've been discussing your latest book, as mentioned, Opening the Doors of Perception, The Key to Cosmic Awareness. And we've really just scratched the surface here. We could do 90 minutes on each of the chapters at least. But that book is widely available, but just share anything you'd like to about it with folks, give out your website, anything you're working on, and indeed just anything else you'd like to share.
Okay. I'm very, very active on Facebook, and you can link it with me on Facebook. You can't become a friend at the moment because I'm at my 5,000 limit, but just by following me, you're allowed to post on the wall and you're allowed to read and join in with the debates on there, so please do. I also have an Anthony Peake author Facebook site as well, it tends to be more directly book related. But if you want to interface directly with me, the general Anthony Peake Facebook site is the one. I'm trying to move away from Facebook in the longer term, and I've had my website completely rebuilt from scratch. So I have a new, fantastic, all singing, all dancing website, which is absolutely fantastic. On there, you'll find the videos and everything else. For instance, there will be a link to this video when it's, this interview when it's up. You'll find it on there as well. You can buy my books on everywhere. You know, they're in bookshops. The new book is in many bookshops anyway. If they don't have it in your bookshop, you can ask them to order it for you. I know that libraries will be stocking the new book, so you don't have to buy it if you want to go with my ideas. And indeed, all my books are in libraries across the UK and across the English-speaking world. If you are wanting to buy the books on Amazon, the books are on Amazon. The new book is there. Please, 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 if you do, please put a comment on. It's very important to me if you do that, and put a rating. If you think it's rubbish, just give it 1 star. I don't mind. Once what you say is fair, I don't mind. But really, please back up your arguments as to why you don't think it works with logical arguments, not just I don't like Anthony Peake because he's an idiot or whatever. Which I do get. I never ever get criticism about my work per se. Nobody ever engages me on anything that they consider I've said that is wrong. They just do ad hominem attacks on the fact of how is he qualified to do all this. You know, he's a sociologist and everything else, which is profoundly unfair, but it's what they do. And also, if you are interested in personalised copies, particularly with Christmas coming up, if you want to surprise your loved ones with a personal copy, if you go onto my website, there is a section there on the books. You can click on the books section and you can order the books directly off me. There is a section there which allows you to actually write any dedication you want, and I will sign the book and send it to you. I only charge exactly the same price you would pay in a bookshop for the book. The only additional costs that there will be shipping costs, which depending upon where you are in the world may be a little bit more expensive. Well, it will be more expensive than buying off Amazon, but that's your choice. But you do help me far more by buying the books directly off the website, because it helps my cash flow. Also on the website there is a little mini window which opens, which hovers in your visuals on your screen till you click it to make it go away, and that allows you to register for the newsletter. My intention is from January onwards, probably I'll be bringing out a bi-monthly newsletter. In that newsletter I'll be writing articles. I will be inviting other people to write articles, and I will be sending links to the latest research around the world in areas of interest to me. So this will be moving slightly away from Facebook and driving people more towards the website, which as we go forward is I think the way I'll be going. But that's the basic information. If on the website I do regular tours, regular interviews. I also do regular talks across the UK. These are all on my forthcoming events list, which is also on the website. Anybody who's interested in having me talk at one of your events, please let me know, because I'm more than happy to do so. And that about is the summation of everything. Oh yes, and I have the new book, Opening the Doors of Perception, has gone down so well with my publisher Watkins that they've already commissioned me and paid in advance to me to write a sequel, which is provisionally entitled Through the Doors of Perception, which will be an analysis of the realities that you go into. Are they real? Which was exactly the question Greg asked earlier. The reality of those things, and indeed the realities of the entities you interface when you're in these environments. That will be out probably December next year. My latest book, which I intimated I'd completed effectively the first writing of yesterday, this will be out probably in late spring, and this is provisionally entitled One Man and Time, J.B. Priestley, the J.B. Priestley plays. And this also will have a section on the J.B. Priestley letters. These were a group of letters that were written to J.B. Priestley in 1963-64, which I was given virtually exclusive access to at the Cambridge University Library around about 3 or 4 years ago. And these are letters from individuals from across the country, thousands of them, all of whom had extraordinary experiences. These are ordinary members of the public. These letters are phenomenal, and the final section of the book is a discussion on the letters themselves, together with some of the information found in the letters as well. So that book will be published by O Books, and as I say, will be out in February, March. Also, just in January, look out for the book Pandeism, which has been edited by Kunjay Mapson, and that will be published across the English-speaking world in January as well, so look out for that as well. It's just called Pandeism. Okay, thanks Greg, it's wonderful to talk to you as always, and we must meet up next time you're down south. Thanks Greg.
Well folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com. where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.